Yes. Good to go. All right. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out again tonight. Beautiful day out there. I don't know about the rest of you, but it was awful tempting just to sit out on the porch for a little while this evening. But yeah, good place to be, huh? It's a little cool. It's beautiful. Yeah. Everybody doing well, I hope? Good day. Tonight is session 6. This was originally going to start out as a 10-session event, but I've been able to contract and squeeze things together. I'm just discovering that this has taken far more of my time than I had anticipated. Sandy's not surprised, but it is, and so I'm compressing it down to trim a few sessions off of the calendar. So this is session 6. I think we'll be done by the end of session 8. Tonight we're going to talk about the law and how we should view it. Then the next, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the word Israel. Who is it? How do we view Israel? What does it mean throughout the scriptures? And how do we align today with that word? And then the last one, we're going to do a session on what we started this whole thing for. We're going to talk about the 7 feasts of the Lord found in Leviticus 23 and whether they're relevant or not, and what some of the meanings of those are. But I figured that in order to properly talk about the feasts, as I've said, it's going to take 14 hours of prerequisite conversation to get to that point. So that's what this is all about tonight. Again, we're going to talk about the law and how we should view it. So, Father, tonight we are just grateful to one more time live in a land and be in a place where we can just look to you in every way without any concerns. Father, you can just receive our praise and our glory tonight as we meet. That is in our heart. We want to talk about your word. We want to be inspired by your word. And the last thing we want is to be led astray and away from your word. So, Father, if we could be gently brought back, or if we could be enlightened, may your Holy Spirit do so for us tonight. We know that your word is for our correction and our instruction and our reproof, and doctrine is for all these good things. And so we ask that you would truly rest in our heart the things that would be helpful to our journey, because every one of us here feel like our mission is to not only be a disciple, but to go out and make more disciples. And so to do so, we have to know what the message is. And so we're thankful for your loving kindness and extending that to us. And so we ask for your blessing tonight through the power of the Holy Spirit in Jesus' name. Amen. Huh? Oh, microphone, Abe, we'll have to get one of those. So tonight we're going to launch into probably one of the least contested topics in the Bible, right? We're going to talk about the law. No one has an opinion about the law, right? Everybody has an opinion about the law. Everybody is either for parts of it or some of it, or we're all highly opinionated, but yet we really struggle. I have most of my life about what part of it is applicable and what part of it's not applicable, and why not. And I got to the point in life when it's like, man, it's only getting more complicated. It's not getting less complicated, because I want to pick through the Old Testament, and I want to say, this is for me, this is for them. Don't know who them is, but this is for us. This is for someone else. And I was just like, well, now, wait a minute. If this is for whoever them is and this is for me, how can I argue that? How can I say that the first half of this verse is for me and the second half? And it just got really confusing for me over the years. And so it's really been a passion of mine to understand what really the function, the role, and the intention of the law is. Define it. Not only define it, but to talk about why it was brought, why it was given, and how then it's viewed today. Thank you for reminding me, for us, the New Testament church, a phrase I do not like. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So there's just a lot of confusion within Christendom, and regarding the the Old Testament and the law. Just a lot of confusion, and there's just so many different paths that people can go down. Some, obviously, on one side of the camp, believe that the law or the Old Testament is just that. It's old, and it really has very little relevance anymore. It has very little life in it because, I had an old brother tell me for years that he just doesn't see grace and love in the Old Testament, and he doesn't see doctrinal information in there. Others say that it still has relevance, that there's things that are still helpful to us, and many of us find ourselves in between. And so I want to talk about that a little bit tonight. And so we're going to talk about the law. The law is, you got me nervous. Everything okay back there, Abe? All right. I am very grateful for someone to leave his family and his children at home and to come out and help us tonight. So thank you, Abe, for doing that. And for whoever it was, Kirk, was that you that turned the heat up a little bit ago? It was chilly in here, and then I saw it going up, and I'm like, I knew somebody did. Thank you. So I want to talk about the law. The law, it can be viewed many different ways. We're going to talk about first about the law that was given at Sinai. I think, okay, I had to jump ahead to my note. We're going to talk first about the law that was given at Sinai. We're all familiar. We talked at length one evening about the marriage that happened on the mountain. The marriage that happened at Sinai, and how the law was the legal binding agreement by which this marriage took place between the father and Israel. And that's the way and the reason that it was the method in which the law was originally given. Now, I want to point out that the word law, almost, not quite, almost every time in the Scriptures, when I say the word Scriptures, I'm meaning the Torah or the Old Testament. When I say the Scriptures, I'm going to use it the same way that Paul used it and that Jesus used it. When they talk about the Scriptures, it's about the Old Testament. And the word Torah is used in the word law is translated from the word, a Hebrew word called Torah or Torah. It can also, this word can mean, a lot of different things. It's referenced many different ways. So when you see the word Torah, we could say, well, it's just the law. But we could also mean the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Sometimes that's referred to as a Torah. Sometimes people refer to the entire Tanakh. In other words, Genesis to Malachi, the Old Testament, would be Torah. So there's different ways. Some people the Jewish people would even go so far as to say that it would include the Talmud, which is post-biblical writings and other rabbinical writings. But for the most part, it's going to either be talking about the law given on Sinai, it's going to be talking about all 5 books, or it's going to be talking about the Tanakh. The word Torah, it literally means this. It means direction. Let's see. Direction or instruction. So when we see the word law in the Scriptures, I just want to dial in on this a little bit. When we see this word, it actually is a word that is rendered, that comes from a Hebrew word called Torah, that is telling us that this is the source for direction or instruction. Now, when we see the word law today, we're thinking, oh, that's something that happens from a judicial setting. That's something that happens from a courtroom. That's something that happens from someone who's achieving or maintaining justice or whatever. But the original word and the original listeners of that word didn't see it that way. And today, in our many years of misunderstandings about some of these things, we have a completely different mindset than the way it was originally given and the way that it was originally heard. The word Torah, which we have translated to the English language as law, means direction or instruction. It's a word that also, in verbal form, it could also mean to cause something to move in a straight and a true path. So it is direction, it is instruction, or it causes something to move in a true path. This is law. Now, I don't know about you, but that's really not the way I have always thought about law over the last 40 years of my life. I thought it was something that you do it or it's a beating. You don't do it, and you're going to be missing out, and just all this other stuff, that it was real binding and it was real difficult, and it's not that. It's not that. It's something that directs. The Torah can also mean this. It can also mean a law or a statute. So this is kind of why the word got translated as law. There is validation for that. It could also mean a law or statute. In other words, something that one is not just guided into, but required to do. So this is really the choice that the English translators made. We're going to take it away from direction and instruction, and we're going to use this. If you look in Strong's, there's multiple definitions of Hebrew words and Greek words, and it gets kind of confusing. But this is the word that they chose best. Abe, we're on slide number 3 now. This is the word that they chose to use for that. For example, if we look in the Torah, one of the words of the Lord to Moses, he says, "Come up to meet me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the teachings." That word teachings is Torah, and commandments. So the word commandments is actually a different Hebrew word. That is mitzvah, and that means basically this is the law. So you have the instructions and the law. The mitzvah are the good deeds that you have to do in order to satisfy. So sometimes the word law is not even the word that's used to mean the word that we think law means. Am I really confusing you? In other words, the law just almost always means instruction or direction. And in one case where the kind of word we would normally use to describe this legal process, it wasn't even translated as law. It was translated as commandments, which is the word mitzvah. So these are things that we pick up on when we start looking at the real meaning of the words. So I just want to point out that for the most part, the word Torah means direction or instruction. And this is what I want us to deeply seat into our heart. This is what's most important. Direction or instruction. Now, I want to take you back just a little bit, and I want to talk about before the giving of the law. Okay, so we know that the law came on Mount Sinai, but there was a time period from Genesis to the law that there was no Mosaic law. There was no supposedly written code. There was no documentable and verifiable communication from heaven by God. So are we saying that there was no teaching or no instruction? If that's what the word Torah means. Was there no instruction or direction before Moses' law? Of course there was. Of course there was. There was direction or instruction evidently clear back in the garden. There was direction and instruction when when Cain and Abel had some choices to make. Abel knew which choice to make. Cain knew, but he chose a different choice. There was a lot of conversation that must have been happening that we don't have record of. And why? We'll never know. That's okay. We'll never know. But I want to point this out. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. Now, but let me have you think about something. If you were the one that created the world and ruled the world, if you were the one, the Almighty, that had put all this into motion and had brought all these beautiful people onto the planet and give them, for some divine reason, give them the exercise of choice, the ability to make their own decisions based on different views and whatnot. If this was you, what's one of the first things that you would be inclined to do? If you were all wise and you knew they weren't. If you were the one that knew everything and you knew that your creation didn't, the first thing that you would do is you would try to protect them. You would try to protect them by giving them some good advice. Mom used to tell me, don't put your hand on that, it's going to burn you. Don't do this, do that. And she did it for my instruction and my... like I was going to say, no. But it was good intent because she was wiser than I. And so God chose to share information with humanity to keep them from harming themselves and to keep them in a way that would be healthy and helpful to them. From the beginning, this is me speaking, this is not found in the scripture. From the beginning, I'm convinced that God gave his heart, his instruction, his advice, and his protection to all humanity. Again, we don't have a record of that. We don't have we don't have really even a lot in the scripture that would even imply or infer that. But there had to be a lot of communication between humanity and the Creator before Moses was on the mountain. There is so much that Noah knew. There is so much that Abraham knew. There is so much that they knew about God. There had to be a lot of communication. There had to be a lot of sharing of information back and forth between God and his people because they knew about making altars. They knew about memorials. They knew about sacrifices. They knew about rights and wrongs. They knew what faith looked like. They knew what it looked like in whom to have faith. They knew a lot of these things. So there had to have been a lot of communication. So for us to sit here and say, well, before the law, they didn't know anything. No, before the law, we just don't have a record of what they knew. We just don't have the manuscripts or the conversations. We don't have the DVDs or whatever that God recorded all this on. And so from the beginning, I am confident that God shared his heart and shared his advice and protection with humanity. For example, he told Adam and Eve, you can eat of all these trees, but not of that one. So there was a lot of conversation that happened. And so what happens to humanity when they don't take his advice? Well, just names it. What happens when humanity doesn't take his advice? It's not good for us, right? There are consequences. There's going to be some negative reaction to the reality of when we don't take his advice, and there's going to be consequences to that. One way of saying it is there's a word called disobedience when we don't take his advice, or another word is, and let's start talking about a word that's going to become important when we talk about the law. Let's talk about this word called sin, because sin is dealt with a lot throughout the scriptures, and we kind of need to talk about that. Before we can understand fully what the law means. So this also comes from a Hebrew word, and I didn't put the Hebrew word up here because I can't pronounce it, and I didn't even understand. It's a tough word to say in English, so I didn't. But it means that you have a reason to carry guilt. The Hebrew word basically says you have done something that gives reason for you to have guilt in your heart or in your life. Which again, guilt is something that must have happened right out of the beginning. Guilt didn't come with the giving of the law. Guilt must have come right from the garden. It means doing wrong or committing a trespass is another way of saying it. This Hebrew word could mean committing a trespass. Now, John, in chapter 3, verse 4, he says that sin is the transgression of what? No, isn't that interesting? If indeed we are, if we are free from the law and we're not underneath the law anymore, and so on and so forth, then why does John say that the definition of sin is the breaking of or the transgression of the law? Why would he say that? Well, we would say that maybe. Once Jesus came, that the law has changed, or that Jesus has modified, or that Jesus has superseded, or we could say a lot of things, but I tend to go with what John said and say that the true definition of sin by Yahweh's viewpoint is that we have been in a position of transgression of the law. And so file this away, and that is the first thing, that it's instruction. It's direction. And that when we break the instructions or the directions, it's an English word that we call sin, which means that we have broken the instructions or the directions, and there's going to be some ramifications from that. Just as sure as we know there had been communication before Moses comes along, we also know that there had been sin before Moses. We know that. Again, we could go back to Adam and Eve. We could go back to the breaking of an instruction. We could talk about Cain, and we could talk about Babel, and we could talk about Noah, and we could talk about Sodom, and we could talk about how all these people before the law broke God's instructions. How did they know? They all knew because there had been a lot of communication happening, and they also knew that God gives good instructions, and when we break these good instructions, there's going to be negative consequences. He said that himself. There was just a later time when he put this all down into writing, and we'll think about that. He says in Romans 5:13, he says that sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. So that's interesting. If John says that the definition of sin is the breaking of the law, then how could there be sin in the world before there was law? Well, that tells me that it's not speaking just of the words that Moses wrote down. It's meaning of the whole counsel of the Almighty. It's meaning the whole counsel of God. And when we break the counsel of God, that is going away from His instructions and His direction. That is sin, and it happened even before the mountain. So we're starting to see that the law that came on the mountain did not tell us about sin. Sin was already here. It just helped us understand some things about sin, which we're going to get to before the night's over. So I believe what Paul is saying here in Romans 5 is you cannot, what he's really saying is, when he says that sin is not counted where there is no law, think about that. Sin is not counted where there is no law. It could almost imply that, well, if you don't have a law, then there's no such thing as sin, or if what happened to all the people before Moses' law? If they did wrong, was there no consequence? Was there no judgment on that? But what I think he's really saying here, if you do some searching on that, is he's saying you cannot hold someone accountable to a breach of instruction if there is no instruction. So evidently, even though Yahweh had spoken a lot of this, there was this view that the giving of the law on Moses was the written instruction, and there wasn't the death to you immediately type viewpoint if you broke that instruction. So I repeat the thought, and that is that you cannot hold someone accountable to a breach of instruction if there is no instruction. And so when he said sin is not counted where there is no law, a better rendering of that, and these all come out of Strong's also, would be probably but or moreover. Let me say it differently with those words inserted. You cannot hold someone accountable to a breach of instruction moreover, I'm getting confused about my own notes here. Help me, Sandy. He's referring to the previous part of the verse, and so I'm going to have you go home, write this down. I'm going to have you go home and check that because I'm foggy on that right now, so I apologize. But Strong's has some better explanations of how we need to understand Romans 5:13. That sin is not counted where there is no law. Okay, I've got you all confused, right? Because I'm a little bit confused. For indeed, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. I'll have to get my head back into that. So we know that the patriarchs and all, to charge to one's account doesn't help me. We'll have to come back to that. Maybe we'll do that. There you go. Sin is not moreover, sin is not charged to one's account when there is no law. I'm still not on my that. So let's move on. It is. It is. And somehow I had that all figured out the other night. And yeah. And yep.
Is that what Paul was talking about then on, I think it's called the Areopagus there in Acts 17, verse 29 and 30, know if I can remember what I just said. Well, yeah, on Acts chapter 17, verse 30, he was talking to the, at the Areopagus, I think is how it's pronounced. Anyway, and he was talking about how he noticed all the different statues of all the gods and all the other kind of stuff. And he went on and he said, verse 29, he said, since then we are God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent. So I believe Paul would be referring back to this, and what I'm gathering from you is the fact that there's still sin, but in this instance here, because they had not been taught about that, God's like, okay, it's in the past, but now what I want you to do with that is to go and repent. So without the law, there wouldn't have kind of been a guideline or something of letting them know that now is a time of repentance because you have done wrong? Is this?
That could very well be. I'd have to go back and reread that to get it clear in my head, especially since I don't have Romans 5:13 clear in my head.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I think you're right on track there. We'd have to sit down and chew on that a little
Yeah,
bit.
because he's talking about the ignorance. They had never been taught
Yep,
until he showed up.
yep.
And so God's kind of like, okay, but now that you're being taught, now you must repent of what you now know that you didn't know before, kind of
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right on track, really. Yeah. And the thought did come to me here out of Romans 5:13. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. And that word but sin, remove that word but and put moreover in there. Okay? For sin indeed was in the world before the law. Yes, it was. But moreover, it's not counted where there is no law. Moreover. So the word but is the unhelpful part there. Put moreover in there. That was the thought that I wanted to get out. That if there is no penalty, I think is another way of looking at it. But I'm going to move on. Okay, we could chew on this for a while. I had it all figured out. Anyhow, so why the law? Why did he wait all this time for the law to come? So let's look at this. So it appears that God has longed for his people to live in community. Since the time they were in the garden, since the time the family was first developed and they began to raise their sheep and till their gardens and everything, God has always, especially in the garden, wanted his people to live in close community and relationship with him in a community, in a kingdom. This is a principle that exists even yet today. That's why we do genuine Christian fellowship and community, because this is God's heart for us. Now, during the period of time between the garden and the journey to Egypt, humanity fell away from this. We know exactly what happened. We've got a record of humanity falling away from this kingdom and this community that God had envisioned. Only a few people really retained this vision, evidently. God knew who these people were, and so one day he went and he knocked on one of them's door, and his name was Abram. So people had fallen away from this idea of living in kingdom. God is the king. We are his constituents. We want to live according to your counsel. We will do what you want us to do. That was the original intent of the life as it would have been in the Garden of Eden. Humanity decided to take a different turn. They took such a different turn that there wasn't very many people left that actually carried this vision anymore. And Abram was one of the guys that carried this vision. And so God chose Abram. Now, we could say, well, how did Abram know God? Well, I'm back to the idea that there had been a lot of communication happening. Of course Abram knew God. For whatever reason, Abraham had been walking with God. There had to have been a lot of things happening that we just don't have record of. And so Abraham represented this kingdom idea. And so God said, okay, I'm going to choose you. Since you're walking by this testimony of faith, I'm going to choose you, and I'm going to bring about a group of people from you. The last verse of Galatians 3 says, from your seed, I'm going to bring about a group of people that's going to represent what it means to walk by faith. To walk by faith. But in order to have a true kingdom of faith followers, there has to be a reset of the moral code and value system. So humanity had lost connection to their value system and their moral code. They had lost connection to whatever it was that Yahweh had been communicating to humanity. They had fallen away from that and slipped into all the the tough places and all the meanderings that they had fallen into. And so God knows in his wisdom that in order to restore the idea of kingdom, we have to start with the family group, and we have to bring this family group back up to speed, you might say. And I'm using my own opinions and thoughts, and you may see it completely different, but I'm just sharing you some things to think about. I think that he had to reset the way that people think. And to do that, he chose Abram. He had to choose someone that he could use that was willing to let his cultural history be wiped away, to let even the memory of sin and so forth be taken away. He had to wipe these things away. So through Abraham and his seed, the only way to wipe them clean and to start over, he had done it once with the flood, but this time he chooses to do it differently. He chooses to take them into slavery. What he's trying to do is get all of the paganism out of their brains and all of this stuff that was causing them to fall away from his instructions, his good direction, his good counsel. I think he had to take them to Egypt, intentionally take them down there in order to take a family of people and start over with them and get them back on the right path and give them things that would not only be good for the next generation, but many generations after. It's one thing that you can teach your children something, but are you teaching your children something that is good for their children and their children and their children and their children and their children? You see, I think from the time of Genesis until Exodus, it was just all a verbal thing, and people had lost connection with it. And so God says, okay, let's do this differently. I'm taking them to Egypt. And for nearly 400 years, he leaves Israel in Egypt, and he puts them into a position. It takes 400, how many years was it? 300 that they were in Egypt? 390 years? Is that? How long was the children of Israel in Egypt? I don't know. A long time. But it takes that long to get rid of all the errors and all the problems. It takes that long to completely unprogram everything that they had learned over the course of all the problems that they had been seeing through what we call the book of Genesis. He had to wipe that away. He had to take them down there and completely, we would call, erase their hard drive. Then the day comes when he takes them out of Egypt. Now, when he takes them out of Egypt, he's got a group of people that has totally forgotten what it looks like to live in community with Yahweh. 430. I got it wrong. I'm getting... That's true. And I'm also getting it kind of confused with the years that the tabernacle was at Shiloh, and I'm getting confused with those numbers. Confusing night tonight, sorry. So 430 years, he gets to the point where when he takes them out of there, they have been so broken by slavery that finally he has something he can work with. And I think sometimes that happens with you and I. I think that a lot of people try to overcome a problem before they've been broken, and they wonder why they're not having success. People try and overcome addictions and personal issues, and until we are fully broken and we can get rid of a lot of things, it's hard to put the right things back in. And this is what I think God was doing to Israel when he took them to Egypt. And so he takes them out of Egypt, and when he takes them out of Egypt, they were slaves. All they've ever known is being a slave. More bricks, less straw. More bricks, less straw. They didn't know what it looked like to live in community, let alone all they could, they didn't understand. All they could see was being a slave in Egypt. And so they divinely needed direction and instruction. I think this is a powerful thing, that God needed a people that was willing to receive divine direction and instruction. And truly, it took a way to completely unprogram and then reprogram in the correct way. One thing that's important, he did not take them out of slavery in order to put them back into bondage. He did not take them out of slavery in order to put them back into bondage. Now, we often say, and I've heard it said, and said it myself many times, that the law is bondage. The law just puts you into bondage. And I'm hoping to take that thought away from you before the night's over tonight. It does not. God would not take people out of slavery and into slavery. He would take people out of slavery and put them into freedom and put them into liberty. That's why he took them out of Egypt. So we got to understand how he did that and why and what it means to us today. The law, if we're thinking about what was given to Moses now, if we look at it from the tense of what he gave Moses on the mountain, the law was intended to be liberating. It was intended to be protective. It was intended to bring them true freedom. Say that again. It's one thing to take Israel out of Egypt, but it's another thing to take Egypt out of Israel and to replace it with what they need to be protected, to be instructed, and to be guided, and to have wisdom moving forward. This is what God was doing. He was not trying to take them into bondage. So without some organization, without some guidelines and instruction and directions, how long do you think it would have lasted, their community as they came out of Egypt? How long do you think they would have lasted without God's instructions? According to the book, they weren't across the Red Sea very long, and they were already belly aching that the water wasn't good enough. And then they were belly aching because the bread wasn't good enough. And then next thing you know, they wanted to go back to Egypt and eat, of all things, onions. Why anybody would want to do that, I have no idea. But they would not have lasted very long. So God was intending to give them things that would be beneficial to them, not put them in bondage. I'm going to make this point many times tonight. So in divine wisdom and in divine love, God prepares a moral and a spiritual code for Israel to live by. Of course, we can process that. That's one thing. But then the next thing is, what does that mean to you and I if we don't see ourselves as related to this family, unless it's by adoption, so on and so forth. We'll get to that later also. So I want to talk a little bit about what God saw when he gave this law. And it's important that we look at this. What did the law accomplish? What did God see? Let's read a little bit out of Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is what God saw. This was the intention. This was the function. This was the purpose of why God gave the law. Okay? The great summary of its function and purpose. For this commandment that I command you today, it's not hard for you. How many times did you hear people say over your lifetime, it's like, well, that's too hard, it's impossible, no one could ever keep it? God doesn't agree with that. God does not agree with the assessment that the law is just too hard to keep. That means either I've got a completely incorrect view of the law, or he knows something that I don't know, or we've lost something through time or something, because he says that it's not too hard for you. It's not too far away. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, we will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it. You see, this is what Yahweh intended for Israel to do with the instructions. He intended and hoped and put it into a set of circumstances where they would literally put these instructions in their heart so that they could do them. And he said, see, in verse 15, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey these sound instructions and teachings of the Lord your God that I command you today by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and rules. Then we jump forward, it says, then you will live. Now, I've always heard that the law brings death. I've always heard that it brings just increased bondage. I've always heard that it brings a burden that I am not able to bear, that it brings a complexity that I can't, that's impossible, and under the law, I'm a helpless person. Interesting that it doesn't seem like that's the way God saw it. So we're going to have to talk about why we believe what we believe, and then where we're at with all that. Because he says, these statutes and these rules, I gave them to you because then you will live and you will multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away from what? His good instructions, his good teachings, his direction. If your heart turns away and you will not hear, but you are drawn away to worship other gods and to serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. And they already know that. It wasn't very long after crossing the Red Sea, like I said earlier, that they were already in trouble. 40 years they followed him in the wilderness until he saw that they were ready to go in. In verse 19 it says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Remember, they're at the mountain. They're sitting there looking at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, the hill of blessing and cursing. And this is where this has taken place. Therefore, he says, choose life. What's the source of life that God is referencing? Himself and his teachings and his instructions. Because this is the way he represented himself to them. Choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. This is the way that Moses understood it. And he had this direct conversation with God about it. This is the best illustration of the function and the purpose of the law that I can find. And I think it's fundamental, I think it's foundational for us to understand what Paul and Jesus are saying about the law. Correctly understood and applied, after thousands of years, this is my view. This is the journey that I've been on. You may relate to it, you may not. This is just my thinkings. Correctly understood and applied, the law would always bring life, not death. Correctly viewed and applied. As we implied earlier, it was intended, or actually we didn't imply, we read it up here in one of the scriptures from the Torah. It was to be written on our hearts instead of on stone. Paul says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3. He intended for this to be written on the heart. Humanity took, and it wasn't very long, and they legalized it, and they then made the problems out of it that we talk about today, but it wasn't the law's fault. It was humanity's fault. And they wrote it in stone, proverbially, instead of on the heart. Now, if it was intended to be a book of do's and don'ts, rather than just good advice and good counsel and good direction, if it was intended to be the perfect moral code to live by, then it was actually pretty weak. It really wasn't capable of doing that. According to the scholars, Jewish scholars, there's supposedly only 613 laws in the Torah. Well, 613 laws is not even close to enough to make sure all humanity does everything perfectly right. It wasn't intended to do that. What it was intended to do is to represent the heart of God, and correctly understood and correctly applied, we will see in this the heart of God. And then by knowing and understanding the heart of God, we'll go forth living God's instructions, and it will be life unto us. If it was intended to be that, it really was kind of weak. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 16 says, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, you will live and multiply. This has to be a fundamental truth, and it stands somewhat in contradiction to what I have always thought that the law was. I always thought that it brought burden, that it brought heaviness, that it brought it brought demands that I could not satisfy, and so on and so forth. We got to think about. In fact, let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's look at some examples. Let's look at some examples of life-giving laws. Now, we look at the first one. You know how it's written about boiling a goat in its mother's milk. And we're like, what in the world? How could this bring life? By the way, this law, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, is, you know, there's instructions in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And all the ones in Numbers are not necessarily the same ones in Leviticus, and some of them in Deuteronomy are not. They're kind of mixed up. Some of them are repeated, some of them are only said once. This is the only one that's spoken 3 times. I've wondered why. It's the only law in all of the Tanakh, or in the Torah, excuse me, that is repeated 3 times. Now, we could say that, well, they're just not supposed to boil a goat in the milk of its mother, and we don't know why. It's mysterious. And so out of that have come all the kosher laws. Not all of them. There's a lot of other instructions about that as well. But out of that has come this complexity about having 2 kitchens and 2 sets of cookware, and I can't eat a cheeseburger because that's meat and cheese, and I can't, you know, all this stuff, it fiddles with our brain, and we're like, Stahl, how can you possibly say that that's life-giving? We need to hear the heart of God. By the way, I see a couple of you taking notes. I want to remind you that all previous sessions, both the PowerPoint and my notes, are on the YouTube page. There's a link there. If you go to the playlist, there's a link there that will take you to, I forget the name. Anyhow, the notes, it's on the playlist, so you can find both there. Pardon? Well, once you get to that playlist, there's another click there, and I forget what it is. You'll find it. So we're like, what? Where? How is there life in this? That you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Stop and think about it. It's really quite simple. And I think that every one of these 613 laws, if we would just slow down and stop and think about them, we would find the beautiful reason why God gave them to us. We'd find it, we'd figure it out. But instead, we're like, that is so tedious. That is so crazy. That was old law. It wasn't for me. It was for them. I'm done. All he's saying to me is, you don't mix something that represents death and with something that represents life, and you don't mix it together. You don't take from the source of life and mix death with that. This is a life principle, and it really has little to do with the goat and its mother's milk. It's a principle. It's to be viewed that way. Yes? Probably is. She wonders if it's something that the pagans did. And that's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. But oftentimes, these laws are, for example, you're not supposed to trim the corners of your beard or around the corners of your head, right? Why did he tell them that? Because that's what all the Egyptian priests did. And they were slaves, and all they really knew is what they saw coming out of Egypt. And all he's really saying about trimming your beard and rounding the corners of your head, he's saying, don't be like the pagans. He's not really caring how you trim your beard or how you round the corners of your head. He's saying, don't be like the pagans. Don't be like the Egyptians. Because that would be a word, a phrase that they would have understood. Oh, don't be like the Egyptian priests. Boiling a kid in its mother's milk. Don't mix death and life together. It's a life principle. We need to understand in a lot of ways that we live. Or an eye for an eye. We talked about this one other night. Does it mean that if you pluck out my eye, that then I have the right to take out your eye? We talked about this. It doesn't mean that, does it? That if you cut off my hand, then I have the right to cut off your hand. No, it doesn't mean that. Because Jesus come along and said, well, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Did he mean to pluck it out? Well, we're quick to say no when Jesus said it, but we're not so quick to say no when Moses said it. But yet Jesus is referring straight to that text. He's saying, no, I'm just trying to help you understand that if somebody plucks out your eye, that there would be some kind of an equal, he would understand that there had to be an equal responsibility to restore that which was lost. So and I use this illustration, and I don't know if there's any cat lovers here tonight. I used the illustration that night, and there was a cat lover here, and I about got in trouble. And that is, if I kill your oxen or your cow, that would require a lot of return because it provides milk and meat and pulling the plow. And if I kill your cow, then I owe you everything back that would pay the price of losing that cow. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If I kill your cat, I don't know you a lot. All right? Because what's a cat going to do? Is it going to pull your plow? Is it going to give you milk? Or is it, there's a, yeah, okay. So I can get in trouble with that analogy, but that's what eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth is about. He says, don't eat unclean food, and there's a lot of reasons. Let me go back and say one more thing about this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You remember when Miriam and Aaron were speaking against Moses because this Cushite woman, he had married a Cushite woman, and Aaron and Miriam spoke really ill about that. You remember that? What happened to Miriam? She got leprosy. So really what happened was, and this is where we have to look for the principles, not the actual account. What happened is what she was doing was spreading leprosy. She was speaking disease and death. She was speaking something that was contagious, something that if she spoke to the people that Moses was doing something wrong, next thing you know, everybody's got this disease. And next thing you know, we're all on the bandwagon. So leprosy is the best thing to help people understand that gossip is a problem. And it spreads like wildfire, and it has to be plucked out. Miriam gets leprosy. Is that the price for speaking ill of someone? No, it was to represent that this is exactly what we're doing or will happen to us if we're gossiping or so forth. These are the ways the laws were intended to be understood. Don't eat unclean food, which basically means if you put unclean things into your body, it's going to bring weakness, it's going to bring illness, and it's going to bring death. So eating unclean foods, we can argue that's like, well, it's pork and it's shellfish, they're bottom feeders, and pigs wallow in the mud, and we can argue that they didn't have refrigerators and all that, and there's validity to all of that. That's why he used those animals. But the real point here is, if you put unclean things in your body, like Jesus himself said, it corrupts inside when we put unclean things. That's what he's saying. There's a principle here. Now, pork becomes the key witness to reminding us of this truth, and that's going to be debated a long time. I'm not going to enter into that, whether we eat pork or we don't eat pork. That's not even the point of the discussion tonight. It's to help us understand that we're looking for the principles, not the laws. And if Israel would have looked for the principles and not the laws, it would have been life unto them. Rather, they started right away making other laws out of it, and writing it on stone, and it became a disease to them. Let's look at some other laws that are real frequent. Let's look at improper or immoral sexual activity. Well, we can say, if I didn't do X or Y, then I'm not guilty. But if I did X or Y, I am guilty. Jesus comes along and says, you didn't get the point. From the very beginning, it wasn't just about whether you committed adultery. It was about whether you had that thought or intent in your heart. And Jesus comes along and he says, you have heard that it was said that, but he says, I'm telling you the truth about what the law was trying to tell us. You see, we think Jesus changed it. He didn't change it. He's just trying to help us understand the original intent, the original purpose, the original thought of the teaching of God. From the very beginning, God is just simply trying to bring things to humanity as he starts this new kingdom that will be for life and for health. We'll talk about why it didn't work so well. But these principles carry many, many good instructions. You can read through, I would challenge you to read through the entire book of Exodus tonight before you go to bed and make a list of everything in there that you think is a law. A legal law. Write it down and start a challenge to yourself. Look for the principle. Don't look for the legal code that you might break. Look for the principle. I think that if the group of us right here tonight, there's maybe 30 of us here, if we sat down in a circle with a Bible study, and we would read these laws one at a time, and we had midrash, if we had a good community discussion, we would discover that in every one of these 613 laws that are supposedly death, we would find life. I believe it with everything in me that that's the way they're intended to be understood. This is the way God's seen it. This is the way Moses seen it. The law is for our good. Now that's a challenging statement. You never thought you'd hear in this building, right? Woody and Carl. You ever think you'd hear that in this building, that the law is good? You're about ready to get up and leave, aren't you? The law is actually good, and we're going to talk about why I can say that. The law is actually good. We are called to discover the principles within the law, not the letter of the law. Every instruction in the Torah, as I said just a minute ago, could be explained as given for our good. So we could say, well, maybe it's all been taken away, and that, Brian, you're making a whole lot about nothing. Has it been taken away? Were they given for a while to a period of time for a people group that it was for them, but it's not for us? Let's look at what Jesus has to say about it. Now, when Jesus came, he was full of what? I'm going to let you cheat. I wrote it down. You can say it. When Jesus came, he was full of grace, yes, and truth. He was full of both direction, counsel, and wisdom, and unbelievably merciful grace. He was full of both. He wasn't all one or wasn't all the other. We have to be able to marry these together. Because people say, well, there was no grace and no mercy in the Old Testament, and I'll contest that all day long. The Old Testament is exploded full of mercy and grace. God is always seen to be a merciful God. So let's look at this. Do not think, Jesus says. This is very early in his ministry as he's just beginning to go through what we call the Beatitudes and so forth. He says, don't think even for a moment that I come to abolish, to axe, to cut away, to get rid of, to undo, to forget about, to get rid of the law or the prophets. Did not. So if you think that the Messiah came to do away with all that, he's telling his people, he's talking to his Talmudim, his 12 disciples and others that are there. He says, if you think that I, the Messiah, came to do away with all that, he said, no, that's not the case. I did not come to abolish them, but I came to be their fullness. I came to be in living form, living, breathing, human form, everything that they were intended to be. They were intended to bring life, and humanity brought death out of them. They were intended to bring good instructions, and humanity made a legal code out of them. They were intended to bring good direction, and humanity made all kinds of heavy, load-bearing. God didn't make the heavy, load-bearing laws. Humanity did. He says, I came to be their fullness. We're going to talk about that word here in a minute. For truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away. How long is that? Has it happened yet? Until heaven and earth pass away, not even an iota or a dot, not even a jot or a tittle, not even a little bit of the law is going to go away. It cannot go away because Jesus is the living, breathing communication of the Torah. He is the living word. It cannot go away. He himself makes the point of saying this early on in his ministry. He makes this emphatic point that it cannot go away, not until heaven and earth pass away. Therefore, whoever relaxes even, one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Why could he say that? Because if it was intended to bring death or legal bondage or legalism or enslavement or whatever, if it was intended to do that, then Jesus wouldn't have said these things, but they were intended to bring life. And so he says, don't even take a little bit away from it, because they are intended to bring life. This word fulfill comes from a Greek word, 4134, and that just simply means, let's look at the word fulfill. It means to make replete. Or in other words, I was so hungry just about 11:45 on Thanksgiving Day, but at 12:15 I was so full I couldn't eat another piece of turkey. It means that the word fulfill means it was brought so full that I am completely satisfied. I am fully replete. My appetite is completely clear to the full. It means, or another way of saying it, it means to cram, like a net full of fishes. Maybe that's why the net was so full of fishes that they couldn't bring them in. It means to level up, like if you have a bowl, it means to level it clear to the top. It doesn't mean to toss, that it's fulfilled, that it goes away, that it's no longer useful. It means to satisfy. It means to execute. It means to accomplish. It means to fill to the full. There's a lot of things this word fulfill means, but it doesn't mean, in any dictionary you can look at, it doesn't mean he came to fulfill it so it goes away. Doesn't mean that. Also, he says that not even a jot or a tittle, a dot or an iota is going to go away. The Hebrew language is very different because it's all consonants. There's no vowels. And so it relies on these little markings within the text to help us understand how long we pause between consonants to make the inference that there's a vowel there, like we would understand it in the English language. And so these little dots and these little marks are very important in order to pronounce it right, to make the right sounds, so that we understand the language correctly. And he says not only are the letters not going to go anywhere, but even the smallest of the markings are not going to go away. These are the words of Jesus. We have to be able to reconcile the words of Jesus. And I notice in all my conversations with a lot of people over the years, when we get to talking about the law, nobody really wants to deal with this. We've kind of made some things work. We've kind of made some things fit out of this text that we're kind of happy with. But ultimately, when we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, the only thing you can do is come up with what Jesus said. And he said it's not supposed to go anywhere. So then we've got to understand what Jesus understood. We've got to understand what Paul understood. We've got to start looking at this, in my opinion. This is just an opinion, and you're listening to me tonight, so you're going to hear my opinion. I can listen to your opinion later, which I'm happy to do. I'm very happy to do that, because this has been a very learning process for me for many, many years. And it's brought me to a place of peace and satisfaction about the scriptures that I had never known before. And so, am I suggesting in any way that I want to go back into a system of religious bondage? Well, one question at a time. I want to get yours next. Yeah. That should be an easy. I would hope you would all say no. We know Brian. He doesn't want to go back into some kind of a legal process. Sandy pointed out, do you want to go back into Judaism? No, I don't want to go back into Judaism. I don't necessarily want to look like they look, act like they look. I want to understand what they understood, perhaps. There's some things that I can learn from them. My goal is not to become legal. It's not to become responsible to some kind of a code of laws, do's and don'ts. My goal is to understand Jesus the way he wanted to be understood. And if I can learn something from some of my Jewish brothers and sisters, I hope to do that. I've enjoyed that. Sandy and I have a lot over the years, but I don't want no. So you're saying, well, Brian, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You're saying that the law is good, but you're saying you don't want to go there. And I'm saying, no, we have a misunderstanding about what the law is. That's why it's good. We're going to go on. Jesus says about those that don't value the law. He says this. Jesus, talking about those who are critical of the law. He says in Matthew 7, verse 23, he says, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Now that's the way Jesus said it. In other words, if you're not paying attention or living the tenets, the principles, the core teachings of the law, he says, go away. Matthew 13:41, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers. Well, isn't that interesting? I thought Jesus fulfilled it. I thought he did away with it. I thought the coming of Jesus did away with the law. And he's like, no. Matthew 24:12, and because lawlessness will be increased. Lawlessness. In other words, people are going to be disrespectful, inobservant. They're going to be speak and act and live disparagingly toward and so on towards the law. Because this is going to be increased, what's going to be the net result of people turning away from the good instructions and the teachings of the law? Humanity is going to get hard-hearted and cold. It's not going to bring life. Life is warm. Death is cold. We've got to be able to reconcile these scriptures somehow. Matthew 23, verse 28 says, so you also outwardly, now we're kind of getting to the key of the thing. Now we're starting to get to the heart of it, as Jesus is sharing with us here. You also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Interesting. Jesus doesn't think for a moment that humanity has fallen away from the good instructions, the direction, and the perception, or the direction of the law. Jesus himself wouldn't agree with the church's modern assessment of the law, it appears to me. Now, and this was kind of Sandy's study that she put together some thoughts here, and she said, one of the greatest distinctions now is we're going to start to think about why I'm making some really radical comments here tonight, and I want to try and get us back. It feels to some of you, I'm sure, like, okay, he has slipped over the edge. Maybe it's time to leave now, but we'll wait a little bit. I know you're thinking that. Just hang on. I want to bring this back. One of the great distinctions between the Old and the New Testament is this: the immediacy of judgment. So in other words, according to what we would call the Old Testament law, if you did something, let's go into some kind of a sexual immoral sin, the first thing, and that was usually one of them that was treated most harshly, you would get stoned. You'd get driven out of the camp. Immediately upon finding out what happened, judgment was almost immediate.
Because that's how much it hurts God.
Because that is exactly a representation of how much our disobedience hurts God. Judgment is almost immediate. And that's what he tried to get people to understand that. He tried to get people to understand that when you make a mistake, penalty is going to come immediately. This is a difference between today. Jesus came along and he said, now you understand that breaking my principles brings almost immediate judgment. Now, after these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, everybody's got that. Now, he said, you've also seen my grace and my mercy, so you should also know that there is repentance and mercy and so on and so forth. But Jesus comes, and how quick is his judgment when someone makes a mistake? Big difference. There is no judgment. In fact, there was this one woman one time that had been caught in the very act of adultery. And what was everybody expecting? Immediacy of judgment, because that's the way it had always been. And Jesus wrote down, and he wrote something in the dirt, and you know, we'd all be millionaires if we had $1 for every opinion about what he wrote in the dirt is, but it had to be something about he wasn't going to give them what they wanted. He had to be writing something in there that helped them understand that I required mercy. according to the Old Testament writers, and not sacrifice. I really desire, this has always been my heart. From the time that Moses stood on the mountain in the very first place, my heart has been to give mercy. And Jesus came full of grace and truth and represented that mercy. Does it change the instructions? What she did was still wrong. The difference being how the penalty was enacted. The difference being what happens when people do something wrong. Did Jesus come and change any one of the old 613 laws? Now we're getting to the truth of the matter. He didn't change the laws and the principles. What he did was he took upon himself the immediacy of the punishment. He didn't do away with the instructions. Yes. That's a verse that I'm going to actually close with. This is a beautiful thing. Thank you for going there. We're going to get to that. What about the tares in the wheat? He said, this is different than the old, because under the old, well, you'd have just ripped the tares out right away, man. And there wouldn't have been so much wheat left. But he says, under the new, we wait. We wait, and the tares grow up with the wheat. And Jesus, in all his wisdom, hoping that that the wheat will grow even stronger and more faithful, and so Jesus will deal with the tares someday. That's the difference. Underneath the code of Moses, the penalty was like right now. The penalty has now been taken away. So now we're going to build on this idea. The penalty of the law has been taken away, not the law. It's 12 minutes past break time. I apologize. I'm so focused on where we're headed here. So let's stop. Let's get a drink. Let's take a little break. 5 minutes. We'll be back, and we'll continue on and try and start clearing up some of the things that we've been talking about. off, and we talked a little bit about what Jesus says about the law. I'm going to make just a little bit. Mylan here she said, why are the 10 Commandments called commandments? That's a really heavy word. And I think she brings out a good question. Why are the 10 Commandments actually laws or commandments? And that's because, in my opinion at least, if you look at that word, the best translation of the Hebrew word there would have been word. These 10 words of the Lord. So it's basically to say that these 10 words are the words. Well, first of all, we know that this was the ketubah. This was what formulated the basis of the marriage contract between him and Israel. These are words that he gave not to be turned into some kind of a, you're going to get beat and killed if you don't do them. But basically, if you do them, they're going to bring you life. And if you don't do them, they're going to bring you illness and darkness and death. Things are not going to go well for you. He says, if you do them, you will live long in the land. And so these are words. So it's basically just saying, look, I'm just telling you, if you go down that hill on your bicycle without your hands on the handlebars, it just isn't going to end well. Now, we could call that one of 10 commandments, or we could say that that's one of 10 good words from the Father. You can view it however you want to view it. We have historically said that this is 10 commandments, and if you go down that hill on your bicycle without your hands, when you get to the bottom, I'm going to beat you solid. That's not what he's saying. He's just, I'm telling you, it's not going to end well at all if you disobey the Father's teaching. So I just wanted to make that comment. Now, we're over half through, and I'm not halfway done with my notes yet, so I'm going to keep on moving. It's so difficult to take all the information that needs to be shared in this discussion and cram it into 2 hours. This should be a good 20-hour conversation to really get to the bottom of the law. So I'm trying to cram a lot of stuff in here, just so you guys can just take notes and think about it. So the Old Testament scriptures, what does Paul say about the law? Let's talk about this. And in our minds is like, well, that's easy. We know that Paul was like, yeah, he was against the law. But the Old Testament scriptures, taken at face value, seem to contradict the New Testament scriptures when they are taken at face value. You hear what I said? The Old Testament scriptures taken at face value seem to contradict the New Testament scriptures when they are taken at face value. So now we're still in this little conundrum of how do we find the common ground here. So I want to talk about what Paul thinks about the law. And I'm going to take him somewhat at face value. Paul says in Romans 7:7, what then shall we say? That the law is sin? Now, again, historically, the church has said the law is against us. It brings death. It brings bondage. We don't want any part of the law, and we would easily equate it with sin. Paul knows that that's what humanity is doing or is going to do, and he says, is the law sin? And he's saying, no. The law is not the breaking of itself, because we've already talked about that sin, by definition, is lawlessness or not keeping the law. So Paul's trying to get the record straight too. In the 12th verse of the same chapter, he said the law is holy. Why in the world would Paul say that if our interpretation of Galatians is correct? We've all got a good understanding of what Galatians is saying. So if my understanding of that book is correct, how can Paul possibly say that the law is holy and that the commandments are holy and they're righteous and they're good? Paul says that the teachings of the Torah, the teachings of Moses, are good, they're holy, and they're righteous. Now, before we get on to our New Testament churchiology and say that the law is against us and it brings death and it brings, we've got to be able to, before we can say those words, we've got to be able to reconcile our feelings with what Paul actually says. Verse 14, we know, he says, that the law is spiritual. Aha. It is intended to be written on the heart. It's not to be written in stone. We know that, Paul says. Verse 22, he says, in fact, he says in this same chapter, he says, I, Paul, he says, I delight in the law of God. Not only do I delight in the law of God, but I delight in the law of God in my inner being. He says, I love it so much that way down deep in my soul, I love the law of God. Verse 25 of chapter 7. So then, and I've always wondered if all of us, as me at least, as previous law desecrators, that's the way I would define myself in a previous existence of life, if I'm going to willingly sit in the seat of a law desecrator, what do I do with Romans 7? Somehow I've got to be able to marry Romans 7 with everything else that Paul is saying. So we're going to try and do that. So then I myself, Paul says, I serve the law of God with all of my mind. What did Jesus himself say? With your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. Paul says, I do that, but with my flesh I serve sin. Now this is something we're going to talk about when we get into Galatians. Paul says to Timothy in chapter 1, verse 8, so we know that the law is good if we understand it correctly, if we use it lawfully. And he's just saying we're not trying to fight one legal code with another legal code, that we're trying to say that my definition of the code of the state of Ohio is going to beat your definition of the code of the state of Ohio. He's saying it is good if you use it correctly. So we've got to know, what is he meaning by using it correctly? And then finally in Galatians 3, he says, is the law then against the promises of God? Well, if we just pulled that portion of that verse out, and someone would test us with that and say, what do you think? Is the law against the promises of God? One side of us, and I would have always said, yeah, I think so. Because the promises of God they're just beautiful. They're just liberating and they're freeing. That's the promises of God. So if Paul says that the promises of God are not against the law, then I've got to understand what he's saying about the law. Is the law then against the promises of God? Paul says, God forbid. No, they're not against each other. So somehow we have to reconcile everything that we've been taught about the law with these scriptures that are standing in opposition to what I always felt about the law. Let's look at some other thoughts about the law. If the law condemns us, then what do we do with these teachings that we've learned to embrace as good instructions? If the law condemns us, if the law is against us, if the law brings bondage, if the law brings adherence to the law is going to put us back into bondage, then what am I going to do with the good instructions that I like about the law? See, I like some of them and I don't like some of them. Some of them are very easy. I can't quote just off the top of my head all of the 10 Commandments, but we would agree with all of the 10 Commandments really quick, right? But wait a minute. If the law brings us into bondage, aren't the 10 Commandments the essence of the law? Aren't they the core, aren't they the rudimentary principles of the law? So if I'm going to say that the law is going to take me back into bondage, then I've got to deal with the 10 Commandments somehow. You see, what happens is we find ourselves sitting on a fence. We find ourselves struggling with how to explain this from both sides. The law says, for example, if the law is so much against us, if the law is against us, then what about all these instructions that say that we should not blaspheme? We shouldn't be involved in witchcraft. We shouldn't steal. We shouldn't worship idols. We shouldn't engage in immorality. We should not smite our parents. We should not be a false witness. We should not kidnap. We shouldn't afflict an orphan or a widow. We should always leave gleanings for the poor. We should love the stranger, and on and on and on. If we'd sit down and go through all 613 and look for the spiritual, life-giving, God-given instruction in that, we would find that they bring life, every one of them. They actually, correctly understood, bring life. This is what Paul's meaning when he says it's actually good. So what then is it that is so bad? Why is it that we would we would run away from the laws of the Old Testament and run into a religious reality where we don't even want to talk about or even consider that might be applicable to my life. Why is that? We got to talk about this a little bit more. There's 4 things that I think we need to consider as we talk about trying to bridge this gap. There's 4 things that we need to talk about. The first one is the condemnation of the law. And this kind of goes back to what Sandy mentioned a little bit earlier, the immediacy of judgment. 4 things that we got to talk about, the condemnation of the law. So I asked the question, does the law condemn us? Now no one knows what to say because you don't know what I'm going to say. No, the law does not condemn us. But yet, 2 Corinthians 3:6 says, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And I move ahead a couple verses. For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. So it would appear that, as we read this, that there's a level of condemnation in the Scriptures. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So we got to talk about the letter and the Spirit. I'm just throwing out some scriptures here to really get you challenged, to really start you to thinking about this, because these are the scriptures that we like to push toward. I'm sorry? Good question. The ministry of condemnation. So, the way I see it, the ministry of condemnation is just the immediacy of judgment. The ministry of condemnation is, I committed a vile act. You, the congregation, are now responsible to stone me for it. The act, or the judgment, the principle that said that I'm wrong in creating that vile act is the law. That's not bad. That's good. The immediacy of judgment is the ministry that you're referring to here. It's not the law. The ministry of condemnation is the fact that before Jesus, the moment we do something wrong, we are immediately vulnerable. What's the right word? We are condemned. We are condemned. That's the ministry of condemnation. We are condemned. We're going to come back to that in a moment, so hold that thought, all right? Galatians 3 verse 10 says, for all who rely, this is the key to Galatians, all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. He did not redeem us from the law. Paul would argue that. Jesus would argue that. We went through, and we didn't go through all the verses, not by any stretch. We are not relieved from the instructions of the law. We are relieved from the curse, the ministry of condemnation. We are released from that. For it is written, cursed, the immediacy of judgment. Yes. And we're going to go to another verse. You're going to know where I'm going. But before we go there, if it be true that the law condemns us, then we have to find a way to reconcile all the scriptures that we already spoke coming from the mouth of Paul and Jesus and others together. We have to. So now let's look at what Paul says about this condemnation, the ministry of condemnation. Let's go to Romans 8:1. He said, now this is right after chapter 7. Chapter 7, we know exactly what he was talking about. He was trying to help us understand New Covenant, Old Covenant by using the analogy of the marriage. He was trying to help us understand about, I was caught, I want to do this, but I end up doing that, and the spirit and the flesh. He's talking about all this. And take the chapter and the verse away. Just read in your mind, read through Romans chapter 7, and go right on through. And he says, there is, therefore, meaning I'm referencing everything that happened in chapter 7. You cannot read Romans 8 without the context of chapter 7. You're doing absolute injustice to Romans 8 if we don't think about where he's coming from. He said there is, therefore, based on what we just talked about, there is now that Jesus is here, there is no immediacy of judgment. There is no ministry of condemnation. Jesus came and he removed the condemnation. So everyone who accepts the life, the new life, the born-again life, everyone who accepts the beauty that Jesus came to bring is immediately freed from the immediacy of judgment. This is the part of the law that is against us. This is the part of the law that brings us curse. Or this is the curse of the law, I should say. The instructions are not the problem. The result of breaking those instructions was always the problem. And Jesus came and says, look, I'm going to take upon myself all of your lawlessness. I'm going to take upon myself all of your law breaking. I'm going to take upon myself all of the areas, ways, and places that you did not follow my good advice, and I'm going to bear that penalty. I'm going to put them between my shoulder blades. I'm going to cast them as far as the east is the west. I'm going to put them in the depths of the sea. These are the things that Jesus says, or the prophets say, that Jesus does with the condemnation of the law. The condemnation is gone. The sentence or the penalty, the penalty of the law is now done away with. Not the instructions. The instructions are still good. The law is not bad. Paul says it's good, it's holy, it's righteous. The instructions are for us, correctly understood. It's the penalty of these laws that is the problem. Now, this is the lens that we have to look through. I'm rushing. I know I'm rushing, but I want to get through this, because if I leave you now, it's going to be kind of inconclusive. This is the lens we've got to look through. So with this very public and world-changing sacrifice of Jesus, everybody understands now that this is what the prophets were all talking about, in that he will carry our burdens, and by his stripes we are healed. Hallelujah. He now takes away all of this that was laid, that should have been laid on your shoulders and mine, because every one of us in here were lawbreakers. That's what he fulfilled. Exactly. He didn't come to do away with it, perish the thought. He did not dare do away with it, because then we'd lose the record of evidence of what he actually stood for, which I want to, again, kind of close with. He took away, praise his name, he took away from us, from our sense of guilt and shame. He took that away, and we're going to get to that, but he nailed it to the cross. Did he nail the law to the cross? No, he could not have nailed the law to the cross. He would have been going against his own counsel to have nailed the law to the cross. He would be breaking his own word to nail the law to the cross. Absolutely not. He nailed the penalty that was in the law to the cross, that which stood against us. Now let's go to point number 2 that we got to talk about. The first is he removed the condemnation. So when we think about the law, moving forward, for me, this is the summarization that I've come to. When I think about the law, these 4 principles pop into my head every time. He's removed the condemnation. The second thing we got to talk about are the sacrifices. So Hebrews 8:13 says, in speaking of this new covenant, which we talked about again, he makes the first covenant obsolete. That first covenant is just simply that. The covenant was ratified by the blood of bulls and goats and lambs. It wasn't that it was a bad covenant. It wasn't that it was against us. It wasn't that it was problematic. It's just that it wasn't everything that the new covenant based on. In other words, he had to divorce Israel. Remember we talked about he had to divorce Israel, and in order to remarry Israel, he had to die. So the first covenant was pre his death. In order for this marriage to happen, God had to die. So now this new covenant comes along, and in speaking of this new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. Does he make the law obsolete? Does he make the Old Testament obsolete? Not possible.
Because Hebrews 8 is all
Because, as Sandy points out, what we're going to get to is Hebrews is about the sacrifices. Hebrews is not talking against the law, the instructions, the beautiful life-giving principles of the law. Hebrews is talking about the sacrifices. So, in speaking of this new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. What does he make obsolete about the first one? He makes the sacrificial system obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete, now notice he uses the word becoming. Why does he use that word? Because at the time he's speaking, they're still doing sacrifices. In fact, they were still doing sacrifices yet for another, well, some would say clear up to the revolt of Hadrian in 135 AD, certainly up till 70 AD, they were still sacrificing. So he's still working with these people. He's still trying to get these people to understand. He's patient. He's long-suffering. He's kind. He's trying to get people to understand what's going on here. What is becoming obsolete and is growing old, it's about, and it's ready to vanish away. The sacrificial system is just about ready to completely disappear. Why? Because he is the absolute sacrifice that all these other sacrifices have been pointing towards. Have they been wrong? No. Have they been adequate? No. They weren't adequate. But somehow in humanity living out this God found, if they were doing these things pre-Jesus, if they were doing them by faith, he found satisfaction in that, and he gave them mercy. If they were doing it for legal reasons, just the same way it would be for you and I today. If we got baptized and joined a church and did everything for legal reasons, there's no righteousness found in that. It's no different for us today than it would have been for them, except Jesus has come along. He's taken away the condemnation, and he has now once and for all sat down at his Father's right hand as the sacrifice that takes away all other sacrifices. That sacrificial system was being made and today is obsolete. It has gone away. Has the law gone away? It cannot have gone away. It's the foundation. It's the footers. It's the concrete walls that our house sits on. Paul and Jesus would never say that it has gone away. In fact, he just came to help make it complete and full. Hebrews, the first covenant, this first marriage contract was sealed through offerings and blood sacrifices. And those offerings and blood sacrifices, that's obsolete. Yes, we can certainly agree on that. Then Hebrews 10, verse 12. I want to think about that for a minute. It says, when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. This new covenant is based on the sacrifice of Jesus, not on the sacrifice of the blood of bulls and goats. Jesus is the high priest of a new and better covenant. Does that mean that the old has been completely obliterated and gone away? No, there's so many good instructions there. But he is the new and better sacrifice. We have to understand that we have to break some of this apart instead of throwing it all in one bucket and throwing it out into the river and being done with it. Oh, we're not quite done because we kind of like the Ten Commandments. And we're caught in this trap. But if we look at this as principles, that the condemnation and the sacrifices and a couple other things we're going to talk about has gone away, it starts making sense. Hebrews is all about the sacrifice.
Because also, Jesus is the high priest of a new and better covenant.
It didn't come on. Put it up till it's green. Yeah.
Because of the old covenant, the high priest there, it was all of them offering the sacrifices. And now this high priest is the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's why the high priest conversation is really completely interwoven through the book of Hebrews. The high priest and the sacrifice has to go together. Yeah, good point. The better covenant is not like a doing away of the old law. The better covenant is about Jesus being this new bride for new groom for this bride, the once and for all sacrifice. No need for any other sacrifices. this scripture that we just read points out that the first covenant of multiple sacrifices has been done away with. It's grown old, it vanishes away in view of the beauty of Jesus. Now let's talk about the third point that I want you to remember. We talked about the condemnation is gone, the sacrifices are gone. Let's talk about the curse of the law, because this is, in my opinion, one of the most confusing scriptures that we could think about as we talk about this in Galatians, because Galatians can be a little bit of a challenge to us, but I hope we can think about it in a new way tonight. Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. I don't have these in. I'll just read it this way. Galatians 3:10, for all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. Notice what he's saying. Is everybody that is exploring and trying to find the heart of God in the law, are they cursed? No. It's those who are relying on works. It's not the people that are trying to get to the heart of God by exploring these principles and these teachings. It's those who rely on that for righteousness. This is what the entire book of Galatians is about. Those who rely on the works of the law to be righteous. And that principle hasn't changed for us today, just as it hasn't changed for them. If indeed, clear back 2 days after the covenant was given on Mount Sinai, if people said, well, I can go out and I can live that, immediately they're going to find themselves in a jeopardized position, because they think that they can rely on works to be righteous. Paul says no. And so we got to understand that it's about those that rely on works of the law. That's what Galatians is about. They are under a curse, not the people that are trying to live out the principles and the teachings of the Scriptures. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide in all things written in the book of the law and do them, exploring the heart of God. If you don't live out the principles, as we talked about, darkness and death will come upon you. If you live out the principles of Yahweh, life and light will come. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. In other words, if you are relying on works of the law, you will never be justified. Does it make the teachings of the Ten Commandments and the teachings of Leviticus and so forth bad or against us? No, they're for us. But if you're doing them in order to become righteous, Paul says, you got a problem. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous live by what? Faith. If we walk by faith, we're going to explore the principles and teachings of God. Why? Because we want to live healthily. We want to live fully. We want to live fruitfully. So we have to understand the principles and the teachings of God in order to do that. And if we slip up, is there an immediacy of judgment? No. We're going to be slipping up probably frequently. If we try and explore the heart of God and we pursue righteousness in every way we can, but we goof up, now, if you say that you have to do it in order to be righteous, that's a whole other problem. But the law is not the law or works of righteousness. We'd have to break this all down, but he's saying the working to be righteous is not of faith. Rather, the one who does them, the works of the law, has to live by them. You see, I don't think our translator's done us any favor here. And we've built an entire Christian theology out of a few verses here that I think are fatally and fundamentally flawed. And I think if we get the whole context of the Scripture together and marry this verse into it, it all flows beautifully. This verse, or these verses taken alone, taken all by themselves, would tell us that the law brings death, and that's not true. So we've got to think about this some more, because Christ, why? Because Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, not the law, the curse of the law, which is if you try to live this out and become righteous by works of the law, that's a curse to you. It doesn't bring life. Christ redeemed us from the idea that we can work to be righteous, and if we don't accomplish it, there's an immediate judgment. He redeemed us from that. So now we go about trying to live out righteousness, and if we goof up, which we often do, I do daily, The punishment is carried ahead forward by Jesus, and he became that curse for us. He became the curse. He didn't become, he didn't do away with the law. He already said that. He became the judgment, the penalty. He redeemed us from the penalty of the law. For it is written, there's a penalty or curse for everyone who is hanged on a tree. Or that is the penalty when people are hanged on a tree. So that in Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles. What's the blessing of Abraham? Faith. So that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. And I forget, was that the last? I think that was the last of those series of verses. So the entire book of Galatians, I repeat, is addressing the simple fact that righteousness cannot come by the works of the flesh. Not trusting in the sacrifice of Jesus alone brings curse. Going back to trust in the multiple sacrifices required is what happens if you trust in your own sacrifices. Jesus became that curse. He removed that curse, not removing the law, but removing the curse of the law. In other words, the stonings and the punishments and the beatings and the throwing out of the camp and so on and so forth. The key in this whole thing, Galatians 3:10, is that he removed us from the curse of the law, not from the teachings of the law. Paul says they're good, they're righteousness. I delight in them in my inward being. He did not free us from that. He freed us from the curse of the law. The curse of the law was if you break one of these teachings, you fall into punishment. So the curse that Paul's talking about here could just simply be said, the penalty. Christ came to do away with the penalty of the law, or the punishment for disobeying. Praise the name of Jesus. He took away this punishment. Now, let's look at the next portion here, and that is that the law proved to Paul that it is impossible to be justified by works. That's another thing that the law does to our favor. It proves that it's impossible to be justified by works. No man could possibly keep it, and God never intended for humanity to keep it. He knew they couldn't keep it. That's why he has always asked them to walk by faith. Adam and Eve were asked to walk by faith. Noah was asked to walk by faith. Abraham was asked to walk by faith. Everybody was asked to walk by faith. But when people relied on the works of the law, that became a curse to them. And now I got off track. Okay, here we go. The law proved to Paul it is impossible to be justified by works. Therefore, he states that he is not justified by the law, but he is justified by Jesus. So let's look at Hebrews 3:12. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. So these people so you see, people could be walking with every intent to keep every one of these laws and fall short. And Paul's recognizing that. An evil and unbelieving heart doesn't mean you're setting out to sin. It means that you're trying to become righteous by your own works and your own strength. And you know, the people that come out of Egypt, they either trusted on the blood on the doorposts once and for all, or they stayed in Egypt and died. That's faith. You either trust in the blood. He tried to tell them that. Trust in the blood and you're going to live. Because the blood pays for your sin. If you try and work it out on your own, there's going to be a curse in that. There's going to be a problem. Galatians says, in fact, Paul says in Galatians 2:19, for through the law, I died to the penalty of the law. The law helped me understand that there's no way I can keep it. The law helps me understand that, praise the name of Jesus, that he has taken that curse upon himself, so that I might live to God. And I want to talk a little, well, we're just going to have to kind of keep on moving. I want to talk a little bit about let's skip over Galatians 2:19, Abe, and let's go to 24. I just wanted to point out a little bit about the guardianship, the schoolmaster nature of the law, but that's a pretty lengthy discussion, so we're going to have to move on from that. I want to talk about the differences now in the way Paul uses the word law in the Scriptures, and this is where it really takes a student to understand first the heart of God, to understand and get these things correct. So when we read Paul, it gets very confusing. In fact, Peter said he's so confusing, I can't understand him. If Peter couldn't understand him, how can I understand him? And so we take Paul and we think we got him all figured out, when in reality I would challenge us to say we need to work on some of these things, because when Paul uses the word law, he's actually meaning it four different ways. One is the perfect law of liberty, which is found in the counsel, the perfect counsel of God Almighty. When God speaks truth, that is good instructions, that's good teachings, that's Torah, which is translated in English as law. That's Torah. That's good, helpful instructions. The other thing that Paul talks about, and we mentioned this in a previous session, he talks about the hedge laws. So people of old found out that, hey, if this law is so needful that I don't break this law or I'll fall into immediate judgment, then better for me to build some laws around it so that I make sure that I don't break these laws, so I'm sure that I'll never get to breaking this law. They called them hedge laws. These are protective laws. So today, it's like many of you here know that if you're in Israel on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, you can't go into a hotel room, some of your hotel rooms, and turn a light switch on and off. That's because if you turn on the light switch, you're actually creating a circuitry closure, which could produce a spark, which could mean that you just kindled a fire on the Sabbath. And so we're like, oh, that legal old stuff is so, and we laugh and we chuckle about how under the law they are. And I'm like, no, they're actually on the right track. They're understanding the heart of God, but they're trying to produce righteousness by creating their own laws. That's the problem. It's not because they're trying to seek the heart of God. I admire that. We could do better on that. But what they're trying to do is satisfy their own laws by creating hedge laws. The next thing is the oral laws. These are handed down versions that result. This came primarily out of Babylon. You know, there had not been a lot of this written down, and the captivity basically said, hey, we're vulnerable. We could get this all taken away from us. We're now realizing we're not invincible, and so time for us to start writing some of these things down. And so they started writing down oral laws that became equal to God's laws. And Paul oftentimes says that's a problem. And that's kind of like the laws of tradition. We've always done it this way. You know, we've always said that you can't do this or you have to do that. Therefore, it's law today. Paul is rebuking all of these things. But just because Paul is rebuking all these things doesn't mean that the Torah is incomplete. Well, it's incomplete in the sense that it invited people into these multiple sacrifices, but it's not bad. It's not against us. It's not wrong. So let's talk for a few minutes about what it means to be under the law. We hear that phrase used often also. Yeah, it's almost 8 o'clock. To Sandy's point, I don't have too far to go, and I'm rushing as much as I can, probably missing a lot of things and being misunderstood. But if anybody wants to leave, I always said we'd stop at 8. But tonight I'm going to try and go ahead and rush on through my notes. So if you get up and leave, I won't be offended, because I'm the one now that's going a little bit late tonight. So you're free to go at any time. And if you all get up and leave, that's fine. Sandy and I'll just sit here and have a nice little discussion. We do that often. What does it mean to be under the law? We like to say that if I'm under the law, that means that I'm a Judaizer. I'm going back into the old laws and commandments, and I'm now having to force myself to do all these laws and whatnot. And it's interesting that phrase actually means something quite different. Galatians 5:18 says, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. So we would always say, well, if I'm led by the Spirit, if I'm walking with Jesus, the law does not apply to me. Romans 6:14, for sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. It's like, aha, if I'm under grace, I'm no longer under the law. That means there are dispensations, and there are all these other crazy ideas out there. And we've got to understand that this is one story talking about one invited people group into being a part of the kingdom of heaven, and God is just progressively, layer by layer, revealing new ways of helping understand this more fully. So from the beginning, they didn't have very much. Was that wrong? No, it was God's choice. Then they had a little bit more, but not the complete package. Was that wrong? No, it was just God's choice. And then they had a new contract that was given on a mountain. Was that wrong? No, it was just God's choice to only give them part of it. And we need to understand that correctly, and on and on and on until Jesus comes. And it needs to be understood correctly. So what he's saying here about sin not having dominion over you, since you are not under the law but under grace, he's saying that the person that earned the death penalty by transgressing God's law is under the law. The person that had earned the death penalty, the person that had earned because of his disobedience, is under the law. Yeah, he's that word under, I kind of means covered. Okay, we'd have to, I kind of forget that connection. We've talked about this so much. We've talked about this over and over again. It's been awesome. You guys, you're all invited to our house on Saturday mornings because no, you're not. But that's when we have a blast on Saturday mornings. For example, the penalty that has now been paid by Jesus, the penalty has been paid by Jesus. And so the individual is no longer under the penalty of the law. That's what it means to be under the law. This is what Paul is talking about when he says that you are no longer under the law. You are no longer under the penalty or the condemnation of the law. And you might ask how we get there with that, but I think there's a lot of ways that we could, if we had the time, that we could work our way. Suppose, for example, that you'd been caught stealing something, and you were brought to trial, and the judge decides that in this case, he's going to pardon you. Do you then think to yourself, wow, there's no longer a law against stealing? If you're caught stealing and you go to law and the judge says, hey, I'm going to release you from the condemnation. I'm going to release you from the curse. I'm going to release you from the penalty. Does that mean that the law has gone away? No, it means that you have met a very merciful and graceful judge. That's what it means. And so the judge didn't take away with the law, and this is what Jesus come to do. It doesn't do away with the law. He himself said, I am not doing away with what the Lord my Father has created.
Because when the woman was caught in adultery, he told her to go and sin no more. He told her to go and sin no more.
Start at the beginning.
When the woman caught in adultery, he forgave her, but he told her to go and sin no more. So he didn't tell her to, oh, now you're free from that. You can go ahead and commit adultery.
Yeah. Ironically, what he said is, you are given mercy, but don't go breaking the law. That's a different way of saying it, isn't it? He said, don't go sin no more. And sin is the transgression of the law. So he's saying, I'm going to give you mercy, but don't go breaking the law anymore. If stealing was unrighteous before you were forgiven, then isn't it still unrighteous? Going back to that story. If stealing is unrighteous, it's still unrighteous. The law is not against us, it's for us. It's just a matter we have to understand. For our world, Sandy and I, we're never going to be a part of saying, in fact, for years, I sat under teaching and I listened to people talk about how bad the law was and how much, and it broke my heart. It really would bring me to tears when I heard people preaching against the law. Because they're talking against the wisdom and instruction of a wise Heavenly Father that's trying to keep us from disease and illness and problems and death. And He's trying to keep us from all this. And for a while, for many, many years, there was an immediacy of judgment that was connected to that. And that's called a condemnation and a curse. And praise that Jesus has taken that away. He's taken away the multiple sacrifices. He's taken away the man-made laws. He's taken all those things away. Those things were against us. The idea that we could work for righteousness and so on and so forth. So to be under the law means you are working your way to righteousness and you're willing to receive the penalty for that, and now you are you're in a bad situation. So let's just talk a little bit about what does this mean to us today. And I want to make just a couple points here. I hope I haven't been terribly confusing because we've had to rush through this so fast. But I want to point out this when we talk about what does it mean to us today. The problem has never been with an inadequate or insufficient law. That's just, that's not true. It has always been the way the people interpret it and live it and preach it and teach it and act it and so forth. The law has never been bad or against us. What's been against us is the fact that we want to make righteousness out of it, and we think that we, because of this written code, that we can obey this to the point that we will become righteous, and that's what's against us. That's what's bad. The law has never been against us. It's never been a problem. In fact, Jesus was the most disappointed with the people who said they were living correctly, but didn't. That's who he was most disappointed with. The people who said that I'm clean and I'm white, but he said inwardly, he said you're kind of a mess. And so I asked myself, how does this compare to the church today? We're coming from many different churches and whatnot, and within your faith community, how does that look? Are we all just really intently trying to seek the heart of God and to, by faith, live out the heart of God, knowing that Jesus is going to be full of mercy for us when we don't do it? Are we seeking his righteousness and his good instructions and his moral codes? Are we seeking all those things? Or are we just we can kind of live the way we want today because grace abounds? You see, Paul has some words about that. I wonder how it compares to what we're doing today. And so this is why I think that saying that the law is bad and whatnot is actually a problem for the church. And I think the church would benefit in correcting our understanding and correcting our activity and our involvement and so on and so forth. If we reject the basic instructions of the law, listen to this. If we reject the fundamental primary teachings that are hidden underneath this cultural, this was all, the Torah was written to one generation of people living at one time with one set of circumstances. Those circumstances have changed. I don't have oxen that fall into a ditch. I don't deal with leprosy. I don't deal with a lot of the things that they dealt with. But the principle remains the same for all generations. I do deal with the heart principle of what they were dealing with. It's up to me to discover it and apply it to me today. And so to reject the basic instructions of the law, I'm going to reap the same kind of wandering, the social meandering, and I'm going to be a part of the complete chaos that comes out of what happens if we disregard the counsel of the Lord. And I think that's what the world is seeing today. And I think that's, to be honest, I think that's one of the reasons why the church is struggling to a certain extent. Because the church, I think, you're going to laugh, the church, I think, has unknowingly, after thousands of years, and remember where we started in this journey. We started trying to document the relevance of the Scriptures. We tried to document what the New Testament says about the Old Testament. We tried to document what the early church did to get us off track, how the early church, we went through 2 sessions of that, right? Talking about how the early church, they wanted so bad to get away from this Jewish problem that they upset everything and went on a different course, and they've got us 2,000 years later convinced that black is white and white is black, and that the law is bad and it's against us and so on and so forth, and therefore we've lost a lot of the foundation that's holding up our house. And I think the church has doctrines and theologies and a lot of things built on, in my opinion, some slippery foundations. And we need to, I think it would be helpful to us to kind of look about this. It's no surprise to me that the church is wrestling with some of the things they're wrestling with, because we don't value some of the instructions that we have that could clear some of these things up. If we're part of the cause of devaluing, we're going to get swept up in the chaos of this world if we're part of the cause of devaluing the good instructions of Jesus or of the Lord. So why does the church struggle to stay focused and maintain holiness? Because, again, I think we've walked away from some of the foundational truths. In fact, we've found out that as a church we can even accept some of the We can even accept some of the untruths about the definition of moral and immoral. I think a lot of those things have changed. I think our valuation of what's modest and our valuation of what's acceptable and our valuation of what the Lord wants out of us and our valuation, a lot of things is governed more by culture than it is by the counsel of the Almighty. And these are the things that I for example, today, even within the church, we're wrestling with such things as, even within the church forevermore, sexual identity. Who ever heard? Really? Or whether it's okay for a man to sleep with a man or a woman to sleep with a woman. Really? We wrestle with that? One of the reasons we wrestle with it is because, well, Jesus is full of grace and he just forgives us miraculously of everything, when in fact the Torah says repeatedly over and over and over again that if we do these things, it's going to bring disease and darkness and death and so forth. I'm not condemning people that are living these lifestyles. I'm inviting them into freedom. I want them to become a part of our churches, to feel free to come in and listen, but we've got to teach it correctly. We've got to love correctly. We've got to embrace correctly. We can't just reject all these people just simply because they haven't heard the counsel of the Almighty correctly. The counsel of the Almighty is not unclear about sexual identity. He created them, male and female. The counsel of the Almighty is not unclear about a man laying with a man and a woman laying with a man. It's not unclear. It's very clear. Abusing our bodies, doing all kinds of things to our bodies. The Old Testament is very clear about that. New Testament, not so much. Because Jesus goes he teaches on the premise, and Paul teaches on the premise, my people, they know all of this. They know all of this. It's the new application that I want to teach them about. Well, we don't understand all of this. We don't spend any time in Bible studies trying to dig into the codes and find out of the law and find out we don't go there. We want to go here, and really, Paul he assumes, he's so brilliant, he's so full of goodness, he thinks we already know all this. He says in the beginning of Romans chapter 7, he says, I speak unto those who know the law. He's assuming we know it. When the church, basically, we've been told that it doesn't apply, we don't need it anymore, so we don't know it, and so we're trying to make new laws out of the New Testament because we don't like the Old Testament laws, and so we're allowing our church members and people to do things that to me are like, really? Why would we do that? We see breaking up of families to serve personal satisfactions. If we would look at the true heart of the Lord as it is written, we would find out how horrible that is in God's sight. That we would break up our families for these reasons and that. We would find out that participating in many worldly pagan events that we do today, we would find out that the heart of God is like, don't do that. It's going to bring you darkness. If you get involved in a lot of these pagan things, and Sandy and I have listened to some of the things that people do within the church, and it's like, whoa, on what planet do we think that that's religiously acceptable? So the irony is that actually we have always said that these are against us, and actually I think they're for us. That's what Paul says. Jesus says these are actually for us. So I don't want to listen any longer to the idea that the Old Testament is a bad thing, that it's an old thing, that it's against us. No, the penalties, the curses, and the condemnations, they were a problem. The multiple sacrifices. Paul is clear to help us understand what is for us and what is against us. He gives us that beautiful grace to help us understand those things. So there are so many things within society at large, and certainly within the church, that I think, correctly taught and understood, would enhance our witness to the nations. They would see that we stand by the counsel of the Almighty. They would see these things. Paul says it's the knowledge of sin. By the law is the knowledge of sin. By the instructions, we understand what sin looks like. By the principles of the law, we understand what sin looks like. That's in Romans 3:20. So I think that the law defines righteousness and moral behavior, and I don't know why we want to do away with it. In fact, I would look at the church today, and I find it fascinating that we will have nothing to do with the law of Moses. But boy, we're comfortable making a law out of Paul. And we'll take some of Paul's teachings and instructions and we'll make a law out of them, and we think that, well, if I do this or I do that, I will become righteous and accepted and so forth in God's eyes. We're okay with making a law out of Paul, but we're not okay with making a law out of Moses. So we need to kind of decide, in my opinion, are we comfortable with making a law out of anything, or are we going to look at the Bible as righteous, God-given, life-giving instructions for our good and for His glory? Or are we going to make some kind of a code out of it that if you and I do this and that, we'll be righteous, and if we don't do this and that, we get kicked out because we're unrighteous? Let's look at what we're really trying to do here. The law of Paul or the law of Moses. A lot of our theologies, in my opinion, especially some of our eschatological views and some of our prophetic views, and they're well intended, but I think they're fundamentally flawed. A lot of our views of prophecy are fundamentally flawed because they don't really take into account a lot of the things that taught in through the Torah. When is the last time you heard a prophecy teacher speak out of Exodus? In my opinion, if you don't understand the book of Exodus, the book of Daniel and Revelation is not real helpful to us. That's my conviction. I think that we have to understand what the patterns that He's showing us and the teachings that He's showing us and what brings life and what brings death and so forth. And so Jesus explains the law like this. Let's look at the way Jesus explains it. Let's look at Galatians 5:14. This is Paul. This isn't Jesus, but how Jesus and Paul explain the law. The whole law, Paul says, the whole law, the entire Torah, the entire good, healthy instructions can be fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Is the law old?